Greetings all. Welcome to another session here of Tuzi Talks. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the history of second language acquisition, primarily from the end of World War II until now. So we're going to take a little look at some of the things that happened in the past. That's going to give us a better understanding of where we are today and how we're going to be moving forward. So we'll look at a little bit of intro, look at the 50s and 60s, look at the 70s, big time there, and then stuff that's been happening since then. Today's research, and the researchers who are investigating language and language learning and how the brain works with language, their research questions emerged from earlier studies, which is the way it ought to be, standing on tops of the shoulders of those who came before us. And they did studies in linguistics and psychology and sociology and even pedagogy, teaching. And although there were other studies and researches and people who had written about language and language learning and language teaching prior to the 1950s, I'm just going to be focusing on stuff that happened, well, since the 1900s, 1950s and on. Okay. 50s and 60s actually got some of their ideas from Palmer in the late 1920s, and his idea of structuralism. And that idea of structuralism served as a foundation for things that came out in the 1950s with Skinner and the others in the behaviorist field, behaviorist school, I guess you could say. Anyway, the ideas that Palmer had are summarized in Howitt. Anyway, he describes the system as language. The language system had a finite number of patterns that language learners used. It was used to learn all the other things that they can do with it. So you had a finite number of patterns that we could modify or play with to create an infinite number of patterns, infinite number of language activities. So we've got this finite set of rules, and that's your template for learning the rest of the language. So their goal was to take these finite rules, teach them as kind of like prefabricated chunks, and through repetition and practice, you will develop your accuracy and your fluency. So you'd learn this small set, and you would learn them and memorize them and repeat and repeat and repeat until you've learned them, and you can use them to modify, to modify. You can use them and then modify them to play with other language utterances. This was in line with the psychology of the day, which was behaviorism. A stimulus response type of thing. If you all remember Pavlov's dogs, you have stimulus response, and you have a repeating the same thing over and over again in order to memorize that pattern and then use it to be able to bounce off into other systems, bounce off into other types of speaking. Now in the 1950s, Skinner wrote a definitive work entitled, I believe it was Verbal Behaviorism. I believe that's what it was. In any event, this work that he did was basically saying that habits form via stimulus and response. And so what we want to do, since that's all we have is a blank slate, everything's just blank, and so we want to just give them these patterns, and we want to repeat them, and so you want to practice. And then the idea of practice makes perfect came out, and they stressed concentrating on areas of difficulty, interestingly enough, finding the areas that are going to be difficult for language learners and get them to master those things so that everything else will kind of fall into place. This was also one of the reasons why we have contrastive analysis. Contrastive analysis is basically comparing my second language with my first language, finding out where those differences are, finding out where those possible difficulties are, and then emphasizing the teaching of language in those areas. Okay, all of this was very popular at the time, especially in the early 1950s. And then comes along this linguistic researcher, Noam Chomsky. And he brings this idea of generative linguistics, a linguistics that generates new words, phrases, and ideas. Okay, so it's generative linguistics. And this was done by a bunch of rules that were in the brain, in the head here. And the mind has these rules, and based on these rules, you can create an infinite number of language utterances, language constructions. So the rules allowed you to be very creative because you had the rules and you could just modify them as many times, as many ways as you wanted. Just for example, just the use of "and," for example, allows you to go A and B and C and D and. It allows you to create a very interesting construction. Other elements as well, but you have rules, and those rules allow you to be creative with things. It wasn't a pattern that you learned. It was a bunch of rules. Anyway, this is what Chomsky was trying to stress. And the evidence that he gave was that it was too creative for students to learn and to play with language and to do things with language because the amount of input was too small. And it's what he called the poverty of input. So if Skinner's idea is right, then there's a problem because there's not enough input for all of the output that's being created. Chomsky then went on to do research activities with kids, and he realized and showed, I think rather well, that kids have rules in their heads that they don't know about, that no one taught them, but that they had and nonetheless, and they could use in order to expand their use of language. They had the rules in their head. We'll talk about those a little later. Anyway, Chomsky's conclusion was that children have an innate ability to develop their language skills. It was already in the brain. It was not something that needed to be input after they were born. When they were born, it was already there. It was an innate ability, very different from what Skinner was talking about. Okay, with this innate ability and with input, kids are going to be able to learn language, learn it quickly because they already have the innate ability, and so that was his idea. And so he attacks behaviorism, and so generative grammar then takes off, and it becomes one of the primary movers in the expansion of language study. So we have first language acquisition studies in the early 1970s, and people began to study how children learn, not only in English, but in a variety of other languages. And one of the things that they learned was that no matter what the language, children seem to learn at a similar stage and rate. So Korean kids and French kids and English kids, they all seem to learn at the similar stages, regardless, and at a similar rate, regardless. All kids started speaking at a similar age, regardless of language. And so they found this rather interesting, and the question, of course, was, will this follow through with a second language, right? The other interesting thing was that the order of the English morphemes also required regardless of the background. So whether you lived in the city in London or in the outskirts of near Perth, it didn't really matter. The acquisition of these morphemes occurred in a similar pattern. Okay, there were also stages of negative construction. This is even more detailed. Stages of negative construction was also similar. How they learned to attach negative. So there were a variety of stages in which they did that. They, the first they just began by adding a no to something, probably at the beginning. No go, right? No eat. And then they began to put on the proper endings. And I'm not necessarily concerned about the procedures there, but that it was they discovered this as they were analyzing language use, that there were similarities. They began to see these similar patterns. And so there's a growing understanding of the rule-governed nature of first language acquisition. They realized that there were these rules. They didn't know where they came from. Again, they considered them innate, but these rules were somewhere, and it allowed them to acquire language based on the little bit of input that they had, even though it wasn't going to be enough, right? Also, they learned that error correction had little effect on the kids. Kids would resist it, and you all know this just by seeing things or watching things. I have an excellent little video of a little kid at the beach, and Daddy is asking the little kid, "Where are you?" And the kid says, "Well, we're at your Ammy." And Daddy says, "No, we're at my Ammy." And the little kid says, "Yeah, we're at your Ammy." And no matter what you did to try to explain, the kid wasn't going to understand it. And I know you've got similar examples in your own kids' lives, or you've heard stories of trying to correct someone how to say something, and they just don't. They're not going to get it. They're going to learn it when they're going to learn it. especially at the younger ages. Finally, research indicated that children can acquire language, they can acquire these new rules, but only at a limited speed. They can't take in so much all at once. So again, you try to correct them, they're not going to learn, but they will learn. It just takes time. And so there were a bunch of things that they saw in the 1970s with regard to first language acquisition. And this is all based off of and branched off of stuff that Chomsky had begun in the 1950s and 60s with regard to generative grammar, generative linguistics. So they're looking and exploring this, but they're also seeing other patterns emerging as they're doing this. Now, when we move into second language acquisition, we see something else that's a little different, and it's something that Mitchell and Miles refer to as the birth of error analysis. Contrastive analysis indicated that all errors emerged from L1 interference. I have this first language, and it's interfering with my second language, and as they began to investigate this, it was shown to be not true. There were errors that students were making that did not come from their first language. So now the question is, well, where do these errors come from? Research indicated that they were making these errors, but then these errors began to go away, and people began to see how there were changes, and they were trying to figure out the reasons for them, and thus began this new emergence of second language error analysis. And so it started to become more popular in the 1970s. People began to study these errors to find out what it is that was causing these students to make these errors. And one of the most famous is Selinker, and he in the 1970s, early 1970s, posited an idea called an interlanguage. An interlanguage was basically a rule book for language that was in the head for the second language learner, but the rules were constantly changing. It was not rules that were set in stone. They were trying to figure out how things were being used, so they would create a rule. The mind would create a rule, and then it would be tested, and then they would notice that there was a mistake or something needed to be changed, and so those rules were changing. So the interlanguage is a set of rules for language in the mind of a second language learner, but it's dynamic. It's a dynamic set of rules because they're going to change. They're evolving toward more native speaker-like. And the closer that these rules become more native speaker-like, then they become more stable. That's the interlanguage. Very important idea here in the 1970s. There were also morpheme studies done in the 1970s. Brown in first language acquisition, and de Villers and Dulay Burt in second language, and they showed similar patterns of morpheme acquisition. There were a pattern of people who were beginning to learn language, and they learned it in this particular order. And this is the order that Mitchell and Miles talk about in their text. Basically, they learn case, they learn subjects and objects. They learn the word order of the particular language that they're using. They learn the singular, they learn present progressive, they learn past irregular, possessives, third person singular, and on down through this list. And they didn't all do it in the same stages, but they did this in these groups. You didn't jump from group 1 to group 3. They progressed in this order for the most part. And so, in the end of this research, Dulay and Burt, toward the end of the 90s, toward the end of the 70s, the middle of the 80s, they concluded that anyone learning a second language, they learned the morphemes in a similar and ordered way. Now, they tried to push this toward adults as well, and that adults are going to learn this in a similar and ordered way. And for the most part, that was shown to be true, at least until research that we have up until now, that people learn the order of morphemes in a similar way. This should have a great impact on how we teach second language, that we should probably follow this order because that's the natural order that people normally use. Second language learners are guided by those innate rules, and they are independent of first language rules. Again, this goes back to the whole idea of Chomsky's generative grammar and the language acquisition device that's somewhere in the brain. And that was the result of some of the studies in the 1970s regarding second language acquisition. First language acquisition rules appear to be different from second language acquisition rules. So whatever's going on in the brain, there's the first language acquisition rules and procedures, and they're not necessarily the same. They appear to be different from second language acquisition. So that's one of the things that they began to see in the late 1970s. Another major contributor in the 1970s was Stephen Krashen and his theory of the monitor hypothesis, the monitor theory, and it includes these five theories. One was the acquisition learning theory, basically saying that you don't learn language, you acquire language, and you don't learn language through direct instruction. You acquire language through input and interaction. So, as far as what teachers teach, they shouldn't be teaching anything. They should simply be giving opportunities for students to be involved in the language so they can acquire it. The monitor hypothesis is that the mind is continually monitoring what's going on, and they're trying to make changes from what they hear to what they have in their interlanguage database, and they're trying to make changes. The natural order hypothesis we've already talked about before, as far as they're having a natural order. Krashen includes this in here, that there's going to be a natural order for language learning, and language learners will acquire those in that natural order regardless of what's being taught. Point number 4, or hypothesis number 4, was the input, or the comprehensible input hypothesis. That input needs to be given at a rate, at a level that is just one step beyond what students already know. That was the I+1 principle. It's one step beyond where they currently are. The input that they know plus a little more. And based on that, they'll be able to learn, modify, and acquire those new steps. So it's basically baby steps as we're acquiring new information. And the last theory was the affective filter hypothesis, that students constantly have some filter through which they learn language, and if the filter is high or thick, they're going to have more difficulty learning language because they're stressed, or they're worried, or they're intimidated, or something that is keeping that emotional shield up. And we need to put down that shield or get rid of that filter so that students feel more at ease and more comfortable learning language. Those were five hypotheses that he put together to form a general theory of second language acquisition. It was very controversial, very popular at the time. There were several states that adopted these theories, and you'll be able to read later on as to how effective they were. They were very influential. You will find people today talking about I+1, or the input hypothesis, or the monitor, the affective filter. You'll hear people talking about them. The interesting thing, though, was that a lot of these things were not necessarily tested too greatly. Some were adopted, but not necessarily tested. And again, we'll look at this a little later. This was big news in the 1970s, and it continued all the way through, even until today, although there is research that goes beyond this. Okay. Another theory that came out in the 1970s was Schumann's acculturation model, or pidginization model. And his research on people learning language, and also people working with pidgin languages. And a pidgin is basically a combination of a couple languages, because there are groups of people that are working and living together, and they don't know each other's language. And as a result, there's a mishmash of language that comes together to create what's known as a pidgin. And according to Schumann, early interlanguage resembles pidgin. So someone who's learning a second language and they're trying to develop the rules for this interlanguage, that mimics very similarly to what a pidgin normally looks like, a pidgin language. And so his idea was that because there are these similarities, the reason why pidgin stays the way it is, and the reason why the people who have their inner language at that particular level and don't progress, is because of a lack of acculturation. Acculturation being acquiring or joining a new culture, becoming a part of that new culture. And And so there are people groups that emerge, and they're not happy to be together, and so it's more difficult to join. Or maybe, I wish to join a particular group, but because I'm an outsider, it's harder for me to join. Or maybe I go to another country to work, to make money, but that culture doesn't like my people. And because they don't like my people, it's harder for me to try to acculturate to them, because I'm not wanted, I'm not liked. There are any number of reasons why people who are in contact with a second language don't learn that language as well or as quickly. And Schumann points out one being the lack of acculturation. The greater the acculturation, the greater the second language acquisition. It was basically his idea here. So we need to find ways to get people to want to join that second culture so that they'll learn that second language. It does say something for teaching, whether it's English is a foreign language or English is a second language, or any other language for that matter. All right. As you look through the history here, especially through what Krashen and then Swain and then people later on, people like Ellis as well, who were with him as well. People later on, they began to see problems and they began to see interesting things to study. And here are some of the fundamental issues that they look at when they're doing research nowadays. Okay. One of the things that they're doing they're looking at the internal mechanisms. They're looking at the internal mechanisms of language, how those things are learned, right? Be it vocabulary or grammar or any of the neuroconnective apparatus as well, the internal segments. They're people who are researching first language and how first language impacts second language. There are people who are doing research on how psychological variables like age or first and second language nearness or using learning strategies or language aptitude, those types of things, and how they impact language learning. There are people doing research in that. There are people doing research in social and environmental factors, like we were just talking about with Schumann and his acculturation, or the feeling of belonging or the feeling of defending your own culture and language against someone others. Those types of environmental factors. Then there's the role of input. What type of input is necessary? Whether it's the Krashen's idea for input or whether it's more modern types of ideas that include not only input but also output, pushed output production, for example, and how those play a role in language acquisition. So there are a lot of areas that language can still be researched today. In fact, I believe the use with computers in particular and how corpus linguistics allows you to do more research in that area as well. That's just a little bit of history of second language acquisition research from the 1950s. It is a quick overview. If you are interested in going back and looking at anything that was done from the 1950s on, you can go do that. If you have any questions about it, you can ask me, and I'll hope to see you later.